The night was supposed to be quiet, just another routine stop for Officer Daniels. But in a world where power can be abused and assumptions can be deadly, one decision would change everything. When he pulled over Maya Johnson, a decorated war veteran, he didn't see her years of service. He didn't see the sacrifices she made, the battles she fought for a country she believed in. All he saw was a black woman behind the wheel. What started as a simple traffic stop quickly turned tense. Maya knew her rights, but Officer Daniels didn't care. His authority was absolute, or so he thought. His words dripped with hostility, his stance aggressive, his hand twitching near his holster. And then the unthinkable happened. A sudden, unjustified shove sent Maya stumbling back. The shock in her eyes turned to something else, something fierce. Because what Officer Daniels didn't know was that Maya had spent years training for moments like this, not just on the battlefield but in life. In that instant, the power dynamic shifted. No longer just a target, no longer just a victim, Maya stood her ground. And when she fought back, not with violence, but with a force stronger than fear, Officer Daniels felt something he never expected, the weight of his own actions crashing down on him. But what happened next? Well, let's just say this was one traffic stop he would never forget. Stay tuned. Maya's heart pounded, but not from fear. She had faced worse threats in war zones, under skies filled with chaos and uncertainty. This was just another battle, one she never signed up for but knew all too well. Officer Daniels took a step back, eyes narrowing. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was something deeper, a realization he wasn't in control the way he thought. He reached for his radio, but hesitation flickered across his face. Maya didn't move. She didn't have to. She stood tall, steady, her breathing controlled. She had been trained for high-pressure moments, trained to read people, trained to hold her ground. A few people across the street had stopped to watch, phones in hand. The quiet hum of the night now carried whispers, murmurs. The weight of their stares made the air feel heavier. Daniel's jaw tightened. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. Maya locked eyes with him, unblinking. "Am I being detained?" Her voice was clear, firm. He didn't answer. She could see it now, the moment he realized this wasn't going the way he expected. His grip on power wasn't as tight as he thought. He had kicked first, pushed first, acted out of anger, but now the story was slipping out of his hands. Sirens sounded in the distance. Backup, but for who? Maya stayed rooted in place, knowing this fight was far from over. Daniels clenched his fists, his breathing uneven. The flashing blue and red lights bounced off the buildings, slicing through the dark. Another patrol car rolled to a stop, doors swinging open. 2 more officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their belts, scanning the scene. Maya didn't flinch. She had seen this play out before, how quickly a situation could shift, how fast the truth could be twisted. She had been trained to assess threats, to think 2 steps ahead, to remain calm even when the world around her wasn't. One of the new officers, an older man with graying hair, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" His voice was steady but cautious. Daniels was quick to respond. She resisted, got aggressive. His words came sharp, practiced, but something in his tone wavered. Maybe he realized how flimsy his story sounded. Maybe he noticed the phone's still recording. Maya raised an eyebrow. "Aggressive? You kicked me." Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. The older officer studied her. His eyes flicked down to her boots, still laced military style. Then to the small emblem on her jacket, an insignia that only those who served would recognize. His posture shifted slightly, as if recalibrating. Daniels noticed too. His expression hardened, his hands twitching. He had expected submission, fear. Instead, he was losing control, losing the narrative. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown. Someone murmured, "She's a vet." Another voice, sharper, asked, "Did he really kick her?" The tension thickened. Maya kept her eyes locked on Daniels, unshaken, because she knew this wasn't just about her. This was bigger, and it was far from over. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears, the weight of the crowd pressing in, the glow of cell phone screens recording every move. This was spiraling beyond his control. He had counted on fear, on authority, on Maya backing down, but she wasn't afraid, and now eyes were on him, watching, judging. The older officer took a step closer to Maya. His gaze was unreadable, but she could tell he was assessing her, trying to piece together the truth. His voice was calmer when he spoke. "Ma'am, do you have identification?" Maya exhaled slowly, keeping her movements measured. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out her military ID. She didn't break eye contact as she handed it over. The officer studied it, then looked back at her. Something changed in his expression. Respect, uncertainty. Whatever it was, Daniel saw it too, and it made his jaw tighten. The whispers in the crowd were getting louder. Someone muttered, "She's served," and he kicked her. Another voice, sharper, demanded, "So, what now?" Daniel's fingers curled into fists. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping, the thin thread of control fraying fast. His backup wasn't stepping in the way he expected. The crowd wasn't dispersing. And Maya was still standing, still watching him with that calm, unshaken stare. Then a voice crackled over the radio. A superior officer was on the way. Daniel's stomach twisted. Maya could see it now, the fear in his eyes. Not the kind she was supposed to feel, the kind he never thought he'd experience. And the night wasn't over yet. The radio crackled again, and Daniel stiffened. A name was mentioned, one that made his face go pale. Captain Reynolds. He wasn't just a superior officer. He was the kind that didn't tolerate bad judgment, the kind that didn't look the other way. Maya saw the shift. The confidence draining from Daniel's stance, the way he swallowed hard. He had expected backup to cover for him, to smooth things over. But Reynolds? He was different, and Daniels knew it. The older officer handed Maya's ID back, his eyes lingering on her name. "You served in Afghanistan." She nodded. 2 tours. Her voice was steady. She wasn't bragging, just stating facts. Daniel's breathing grew shallow. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and now the very people he expected to back him up were hesitating. The tension in the air was razor-sharp, the weight of every passing second pressing down on him. Then a sudden movement. A civilian in the crowd pushed forward, phone still recording. "Hey, I know her," he said, voice rising. "She saved my cousin overseas. She's a hero." A murmur spread through the onlookers, growing louder, angrier. Maya didn't move, but inside, something shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. Daniels took a step back. For the first time, he looked unsure. The walls were closing in, and he had nowhere to run. And then, just as the sirens grew louder, just as the weight of his choices seemed unbearable, he made another. One that no one saw coming. Daniel's eyes darted between the growing crowd, the flashing lights, and Maya's unshaken stance. His breath came faster now, his chest rising and falling as panic settled in. He had lost control, and worse, he knew it. Then, in a sudden, desperate move, he reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around," he barked at Maya, his voice unsteady. "You're under arrest." The older officer stepped forward. For what? His tone was calm but firm, his gaze locked onto Daniels with a warning edge. Daniels hesitated. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out, because there was no answer, no reason, no justification. The weight of the moment crushed him. The crowd knew. The officers knew. And Maya, she just stood there waiting. Before he could make another move, a new voice cut through the tension. "Stand down, Daniels." The crowd parted as Captain Reynolds stepped into the scene. His presence was commanding, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Maya, then at Daniels, who looked like a man on the edge of unraveling. Reynolds took a slow step closer. I saw the footage, he said, and so will internal affairs. Daniel's face drained of color. The final blow had landed. For the first time that night, Maya allowed herself to breathe. The battle was over. But just as relief started to settle in, Reynolds turned to her, his eyes sharp. "There's something you should know," he said. Daniels wasn't acting alone. And just like that, the real fight was only beginning. Maya's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady, but her mind already working through the possibilities. Captain Reynolds exhaled, glancing at the officers still standing around. The weight of the moment settled over everyone. "We've been looking into a pattern of complaints. Daniels wasn't the only one abusing his badge." Maya felt a familiar frustration rise in her chest. She had fought battles overseas, but this was another war entirely, one fought in silence, in shadows, where power was used as a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. Daniels stood frozen, his face twisted in panic. The crowd, once just observers, now murmured louder. Some angry, some shocked. The truth was out, and there was no undoing it. Reynolds motioned to another officer. "Take his badge." The words were final, sharp. Daniels flinched but didn't fight back. He knew it was over. Maya watched as he was led away, his once unwavering authority stripped in seconds. But even as justice seemed to take its course, she knew this wasn't the end. One man being held accountable wasn't enough. As she turned to leave, a woman in the crowd caught her arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing up." Maya simply nodded, because that's what this was about. Not just one fight, one night, or one badge. It was about something bigger. And though her battle here was over, she knew the fight for justice was far from finished.